Okay, so good day everyone. In this presentation, I am going to discuss the different components of the plasma membrane and the different types of transport mechanism. Okay, so when we say cell transport, it refers to the movement of substances across the cell membrane. And the transport has something to do with the structure of the cell membrane. Okay, so as we all know, the cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane. So, it facilitates the movement of molecules inside and outside of the cell, plant or animal cell. Okay, so here are some function of the plasma membrane. Okay, so first is it controls what enters the cell to maintain the internal balance called the homeostasis. Second, it provides protection and support for the cell. In addition to that, the cell membrane also allow cell-to-cell recognition and provide a binding site for enzymes. So those are the few functions of the cell membrane. Okay, so moving on, we have here the structures of the cell membrane. Okay, so the cell membrane is composed of two layers of phospholipids. We have the phosphate head, which is polar and water-loving. We have the fatty acid tails, which is non-polar or water-fearing. We also have the proteins that are embedded in the membrane. And lastly, we have the carbohydrates. The hydrophilic head is composed of a phosphate group and glycerol. Okay, so this head or the hydrophilic head is exposed to the exterior or facing outward to the aqueous or watery fluid environment of inside and outside of the cell. Okay, so moving on, we have the hydrophobic tail. Okay, so this hydrophobic tail consists of saturated fatty acids which has no double bond, and as a result it has a straight tail. And lastly, we have the unsaturated fatty acids wherein it is consist of double band, and as a result it has crook and kink tail. Okay, so this hydrophobic tail is located in between the hydrophilic head. Okay, so they are non-polar and water-fearing. Okay, so moving on, we have the proteins that are embedded or located in the plasma membrane. First is we have the integral proteins. Okay, so these proteins are integrated into the membrane that penetrates the lipid bilayer. In addition, they pass entirely through the lipid bilayer and protrude from both the extracellular and cytoplasmic side of the cell membrane. Next is we have the peripheral proteins. These membrane proteins are associated within the surface of the cell membrane and found either on the cytoplasmic or extracellular side. Okay, so unlike the integral proteins, they do not stick into the hydrophobic core and they tend to be more loosely attached. Lastly, we have the carbohydrates. Okay, so these carbohydrates are the third major component of the cell membrane. Okay, and usually they are found or located outside the surface of the cell. And lastly, these carbohydrates may consist 2 or 60 monosaccharide units that can either be straight or unbranched. Okay, so as I've mentioned a while ago, the cell membrane is a selective permeable. Okay, so when we say selective or semi-permeable, it only allow or let in some molecules inside the cell. Okay, so phospholipid bilayer with some protein and the carbohydrates make the cell membrane as a selective permeable. Okay, so moving on, we have two types of cellular transport. Okay, so we have the passive and active transport. Okay, so when we say passive transport, It involves the movement of materials through the membrane without the use or expenditure of energy. Okay? And lastly, the molecules move from the area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay, so we have three types of passive transport. So we have the diffusion or the simple diffusion, we have the facilitated diffusion, and lastly we have osmosis. So when we say diffusion, it is the random movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Steroids, alcohol, urea, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrophobic molecules such as the lipid pass through the cell membrane down to their concentration gradient by means of simple diffusion. In addition to that, the kinetic energy of the molecules result in the random movement of the molecules. Okay, so to further understand the concept of simple diffusion, so try to spray a perfume in your room. Okay, so later on, you'll notice that you can smell the scent of that perfume in your kitchen. So parang ganun yung concept ng diffusion natin. Okay, so inside the bottle, the perfumes are more tightly packed. Pero kapag in-spray mo na siya, nagiging less tightly packed sila. Okay, because they diffuses to the particles of the air. Kaya kumakalat yung amoy ng perfume. So, yun yung simple example ng simple diffusion natin. Okay? Okay, so another example is the tea bag, yung Lipton. Okay, so for example, you have a tea. Okay, so try to place that tea inside a cup of hot water. Okay, so as you can observe, makikita mo na nagdi-diffuse yung particle ng tea sa hot water. Okay, so isa ulit yon sa example ng simple diffusion natin. Next is we have the facilitated diffusion. Okay, so this type of diffusion is a specific in facilitated diffusion, the diffusion of specific particles through the transport proteins found in the membrane. Okay, so they transport large and charged molecules and polar molecules such as the carbohydrates, amino acids, nucleosides, and ions to cross the plasma membrane. Okay, so these transport proteins are specific. So they only select certain molecules to cross the membrane. Okay, so we have two types of proteins that are used in facilitated diffusion. So we have the channel protein and the carrier protein. Okay, so first is we have the carrier protein. Okay, so these proteins binds with specific molecules to be transported on one side of the membrane. Okay, so they undergo changes in shape that allows the molecules to pass through the membrane and release to the other side. Next is we have the channel protein. Okay, so these channel proteins form open pores through the membrane and allows the free diffusion of any molecules of the appropriate size and charges. Okay, so take note that even the facilitated diffusion involves transport proteins, it is still a passive transport because the solute is moving down to the concentration gradient. Next is we have osmosis. Okay, so osmosis is the diffusion of water through the selective permeable membrane. Okay, so water moves from high to low concentration. Okay, so we have three types of solution under osmosis. Okay, so before we continue, let's define few terminologies first. Okay, so when we say solution, it is when water is mixed with other molecules and water is the solvent. Okay, and solute, it is the dissolved substances. And lastly, when we say concentration gradient, it is the unequal distribution of molecules. Okay, so here in hypotonic solution, the concentration of solute in the solution can be less than the concentration of solute in the cell. Okay, so what happens is that the water will tend to move from the solution to the inside of the cell. And as a result, the cell will swells and burst open. Okay, so hypo means less than normal. The second type of solution is the hypertonic solution. So hyper means greater than normal. Okay, so when we say hypertonic solution, the concentration of the solute in the solution can be greater than the concentration of solute in the cell. So as you can see, we have here the red blood cell in the middle, and in the right, we have the vacuole of plant cell. So as you can see, the water moves from inside of the cell into the solution. So as a result, the cell will shrink. Okay, so it is called the plasmolysis. Lastly, we have here the isotonic solution. Okay, so iso means equal or same as normal. Okay, so isotonic solution is a solution wherein it is equal to the concentration of the solute in the cell. So the water will move equally in both direction and the cell will remain the same size. Okay, so for the animal cell, especially in blood cell, so they prefer the isotonic solution or environment, because in this environment, the blood cell will retain its normal shape, which is the biconcave shape. Okay, so this shape of the blood cell, the biconcave, it allows the red blood cell to bend and flow smoothly through the capillaries. Okay, so what will happen if the red blood cell is exposed to hypertonic and hypotonic solution? Okay, so tulad ka nang na-mention ko kanina, it's either the cell will shrink or burst. So kapag nangyari yon, the shape of RBC will change and it will not carry out its function wherein it is to carry oxygen. Okay, so how about in plant cell? Okay, so for the plant cells, they prefer hypotonic environment because they will be able to take on water and the plant will become turgid. So when we say turgid, they are swollen and hard. Okay, so turgidity is very important to plants because it helps to maintain the rigidity and stability of the plant tissues, which allow the green parts of the plant to stand up into the sunlight. So, as you can recall, during the previous module, sa first module natin, so, the plant cell is composed of a vacuole wherein it occupies 90% of the plant cell. Okay, so, these vacuoles store nutrient, waste, and water. And water in plant is very essential, especially in transporting nutrients throughout the plant tissues. Another is that plant cell needs a lot of water for photosynthesis to take place, because if plants do not get enough water, photosynthesis will slow down. Okay, to sum it up, passive transport is the movement of materials through the cell membrane without the expenditure or use of energy. And we have three types of transport under the passive transport. So we have the diffusion, wherein there is a random movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay, so oxygen, carbon dioxide, and etc. moves or enter the cell through diffusion. Next is we have the facilitated diffusion. Okay, so this diffusion allows the polar and charged molecules such as the carbohydrates, amino acids, nucleosides, and ions to cross the plasma membrane. And lastly, we have the osmosis. So it is the movement of water or the diffusion of water through the selective permeable membrane. And under osmosis, we have three types of solution. So we have isotonic solution wherein water moves equally in both direction and the cell remain the same size. Next is we have hypotonic. And in this solution, water moves from the solution to the inside of the cell. So here, the cell will swells and burst open. Lastly, we have hypertonic. Water in this solution moves from the inside of the cell into the solution. So it causes the cell to shrink.